Well, good evening and welcome to everyone. It's lovely to know that people are around. Do feel free to put your screens on if you want to do so, and we'll say hello to one another. My name is Steve Osse-Mensah, and I'm the Work Forum Director here at LICC. Lovely to see various screens coming on and some people and faces that I know well, which is great. A really warm welcome. We're a fairly select crew this evening, but that is fine because the topic is an excellent one. So well done for being here. I'm conscious that many of us may well be feeling in days of sort of getting a bit more face-to-face, that Zoom is a bit passé. And if that's the case, well, we'll try and make it as lively as possible. My co-presenters, and actually the people doing all the work this evening, are Beth Yearsley and Tim Yearsley. Beth, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in a minute, and Tim, I'm going to do the same because I'm just going to do that. So Beth, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hi everybody, it's so good to be with you tonight and lovely to see some of you on screen. My name is Beth. I'm the People and Organisational Development Manager at the University of Nottingham Students' Union, which basically means that I'm head of HR, I'm head of governance, I'm head of health and safety, and I'm head of all learning and development for our 250 members of staff who represent 34,000 students at the University of Nottingham. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks. And what Beth hadn't said is she also helps to run a church. Those of you know about the Anglican Church and know anything about interregnums, though that wardens tend to be very busy people, and Beth is one of those as well. So just something else she gets up to. Tim, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and hi everyone. Good to see some familiar faces and some new faces. My name's Tim. I head up LICC's work with emerging generations, which is essentially people in their first decade of work, although we're fuzzy about where that starts and ends. So that's my main role. And when I'm not doing things with the LICC, I like to dabble in a bit of music, and I play in a band, which I can tell you more about if you want to know more about it. But I feel like most people are sick of me going on about it, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tim. That's fine. Just occasionally when he leads things, we've got a bank of guitars behind him. But today we have the royal purple screen, so we're not seeing any of that. Well, again, a really warm welcome. I'm looking forward to tonight because in my business career, which was so far all of 33 years, I'm still a non-executive director, so I still do stuff outside LICC. There were many times in banking and finance, and certainly when I was partnering with PwC and EY, where I faced difficult decisions. And when I look back, where I probably could have made better decisions. So I hope, like me, you're looking forward to this evening. Well, just as we open up the evening, why don't I pray to begin with, and then I'll hand over to Tim. Let's just pray together, shall we? Our loving Lord Jesus Christ, thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for bringing us through whatever days that we've been in today to this evening. And I'm conscious, Lord, that some of my friends may be tired at the end of a busy day and coming towards the end of a busy week. Some may be elated by the day that they've had. Others may be just struggling to get through the end of it, frankly. Some may be looking forward to this evening, and some maybe, but are quite tired. So I just pray, Lord, that you'll meet us exactly where we are. We thank you that you say in your word that where 2 or 3 people gather together, and we believe that includes online as well, you are with us. So we pray that you will be with us, Lord. We welcome you into our presence by your Spirit, and pray, Lord, that you'll very much be with us as we listen to your word, as we listen to stories from one another, and as we look to discern together how to make better decisions in our lives, and particularly in our work as well. Pray that you bless Beth and Tim as they lead us, and we thank you again for this time. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. So, workplace habits for better decisions. Welcome from me, more formally. I don't know exactly why you've come this evening, but I can pretty much guarantee that at work, you're facing decisions of some magnitude every single day. And actually, we all face all kinds of decisions, whatever work we're doing. Sometimes they're micro decisions that we might not even think about. Sometimes they're huge, big life trajectory kind of decisions. So I guess I'm thinking about decisions about how to use my time, how to manage relationships in a workplace, to decide when something is good enough to move on to the next thing, maybe when to leave a job or when to stay in a job, when to stay quiet and when to speak up, what piece of what project needs to happen in what order. The list goes on, and in a moment, I hope that you might be able to bring some real life decisions that you're facing in your workplace into conversation this evening that might make it a bit more real for you. I'm aware that making decisions in a workplace context is not easy, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to host this evening. What happens a lot of the time when we're faced with decisions at work is something that's come to be referred to as accountability anxiety, and lots of people resonate with this when I explain it, so see if it makes sense to you. Accountability anxiety is this hesitance to make a decision because of the fear of what will happen if we get it wrong and we're held accountable for that decision going wrong, or for the consequences of the decision that we made not panning out the way we thought it was going to. So I'm aware that accountability anxiety is in the air when we're talking about making better decisions at work. And I hope that we're going to combat that this evening, because we're not just going to give you a formula for how to make better decisions, but we're going to be thinking about how to become the kind of person who makes better decisions. And part of making better decisions is making decisions less anxiously. I want to start by telling you a little bit about, a case study of my own. I say my own, obviously I stole it from somewhere. But I think it illustrates a good point about how we make decisions, or how maybe to not make decisions. So many of you will be familiar with a company that goes by the name of Xerox, and Xerox make machines that look like this, photocopier, printer things. You might even have one in your office. Now, Xerox a few years ago wanted to downskill the task of repairing these machines when they went wrong, which they often do. If you work with them, you'll know they're often broken or they've run out of paper or something. So Xerox decided to try and document every imaginable breakdown in their machines, so that when a technician showed up to repair the machine, all they had to do was look it up in this massive manual, follow a decision tree to kind of test and diagnose what the problem was, and then be able to fix the machine. Now, you can guess what happened. The technicians rock up to fix the Xerox machines. One in particular is looking at an error code and this malfunction that doesn't match the manual. So what do? There's nothing similar has been covered in his training. So he calls a specialist, and the specialist does what a specialist does on the other end of the phone, which is, have you followed the manual? Yes, I've followed the manual. We've already done that when we call up the specialist, but that's what they tell us to do. That doesn't work, so the specialist ends up baffled as well. They could have just given up and replaced the machine, but that would have been expensive and a bit embarrassing for Xerox as well. So instead, this technician and the specialist on the phone, they start fumbling around, experimenting, adapting, evaluating, is this going better or worse than it was before, thinking about what they know from their previous experiences and stories that they've heard from others. And finally, after 5 hours of trial and error, they find the solution and they get their Xerox machine in this office working again. And I think decision-making in most jobs is like that. There's experimentation, there's iteration, there's fumbling around. Making decisions in real life is rarely a case of if X, then Y, as if we were just following some perfect instruction manual. What you'll have heard in that little example, which is a true story, by the way, was that it was the wisdom of the repair technician that led him to be able to solve the problem. He was someone who had the ability to see what was relevant in that situation and to be able to experiment and adapt and evaluate until we reached a solution that was satisfactory for everyone. And that, I think, is one way into what we really want to get across this evening, a conviction that we share, I think, which is that you're not going to make better decisions by following a decision tree, if that even existed. You make better decisions by becoming a better decision maker, just as you fix Xerox machines by becoming a better Xerox technician. So now it starts to get interesting. How do you become a better decision maker so that you can make better decisions? Well, I'm going to do a bit of Bible. If you have one to hand, you might like to flick to Matthew 7, although it's going to come up on the screen as well. I'm sure this will be a parable that's familiar to many of you. So Jesus tells a story about 2 builders. And Beth, just for a change of voice, would you mind reading this out for us?
Sure. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Thanks. So a few reflections on this passage that I hope will set us up well for what's to come this evening, and why we want to share with you what we want to share in the way that we want to share it. So there's some important similarities and differences between these two builders. You'll notice that both of the houses are subject to storms, and the storms reveal not only the quality of the house, but the quality of the house builder. The first house was built by a builder who decided to build on rock, and so the house doesn't fall down. And the second house has been built by a builder who decided to build on sand, and it falls with a great crash, Jesus says. Jesus describes the first builder as wise, and the second builder is described as foolish. So what's the difference between these two builders? Well, both have heard the words of Jesus. That's not the difference between them. And in this context, Jesus' words are the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount that he's just given in the preceding 3 chapters of Matthew's Gospel. And the Sermon on the Mount is kind of Jesus' manifesto for a way of life that is built on wisdom. They've both heard the words, but only one of them has put those words into practice. So that's the difference. Both have heard the words, but one puts them into practice. And I think Jesus' invitation to us as hearers is to think about what kind of builders we want to be, or if not builders, what kind of Xerox repair technicians or accountants or lawyers or doctors or teachers or street sweepers we want to be. Do we want to be wise or foolish? Do we want to put Jesus' words into practice, or just hear them and think that that's enough? Because when the storms come, our decisions will be tested, and our wisdom or foolishness as builders will be revealed. So in this session, we don't want to teach you how to build better houses any more than we want to give you a decision tree to follow for any and every decision you might have to make at work. But we want to follow Jesus' lead and think together about how we become the kinds of people who make better decisions, as I've said. So we are going to share a decision-making model with you, but please don't just go away with the model. Hear the underlying habits that we're offering that are ways of putting into practice the kind of life that Jesus calls us into, so that we might become wise enough people to use this model or to build better houses, so to speak. So this model is slightly adapted from a situational decision-making workshop run by CIPD, but we have reflected on it, put our own experiences on it, and tried to anchor it in some practices that will, as I said, help us become wiser builders, wiser decision makers. As I say, it's not a formula. The reality is decision-making is always messy, complex, and dynamic, and every aspect of this model that we're going to show you is probably happening simultaneously in real life. So that's why I put these arrows. They're all happening interchangeably. But nevertheless, it's an abstraction, and it might help us think about how we make decisions, and might help us shine a light on what kind of habits we need to form us into better decision makers. So, of course, in a storm, when the storm comes, we won't be able to pull up this model. You need to internalize it. And with that said, I'm going to pass over to Beth, who's going to show us how to begin internalizing it, or what the first part of the model is, so that we might learn it and live it. Over to you, Beth.
Great, thanks, Tim. Okay, so when we're thinking about what does it actually mean to put God's work into practice, so that our foundations, what we're building on, the kind of lives that we're building, are going to stand when it comes into the storm. So there's a few things that we're going to go through, but I wanted to start off by thinking about reducing our bias. Now, I do a lot of training in my role around unconscious bias, particularly when it comes to things like recruitment. And so this concept, or even maybe this word bias, I find can often make people potentially feel quite uncomfortable. Sometimes I get people worried that they're going to be labelled as a biased person, or some people on the other end might even refuse to acknowledge that they have any biases, and they state that they're always open, that they don't treat anybody any more or less favourably. But the point that we're actually trying to make here is that every person, every one of us, me, you, everyone on this call, has their own unique experiences of life. Okay, have our own unique things that have been good in our experiences, and things that have not been good in terms of the experiences that we've had so far. And there are going to be ways of doing things, ways of speaking to people, ways that maybe your family or your friends or your social circle act, that you learn from those around you what is good. And that is a natural part of what it is to be a human person. And that is a good thing. Okay, that is a good thing. But what that can unconsciously do is get us into a groove of thinking in a particular way. So, for example, some people might say that you should always shake somebody's hand when you first meet them, or that you should always look someone in the eye when you're talking to them. But that might actually be very difficult for somebody who's neurodiverse. So our ways of doing things are just one way. And we want to start thinking about making better decisions in the workplace by reducing our bias, okay, or to reframe that into a more positive statement to increase our awareness of others. So by taking off our kind of natural inbuilt blinkers and proactively seeking out the experiences of other people around us, we're going to have a broader range of information or data, if you're geeky like I am, to inform the decisions that we're actually making. So to give you an example of this from my own life, as lockdown restrictions have eased, a lot of organisations, maybe yours, have started considering hybrid working. So as people and organisational development manager, it's my job to write and implement our people policies, including our new interim hybrid working policy. So following a period where we were all working remotely, so we were all completely 100% working from home, in September, we launched our new interim hybrid working policy, which allows our staff to work a blend of remote and in-person working patterns. So I wrote the first draft of the policy stating that remote working must not take up more than 40% of the working hours for each role. So when I sent the policy out for feedback to our managers, our finance director came back to me straight away saying that actually she would really struggle with that because she works part-time and she would find it difficult with such a defined percentage to be in the office in a way that would actually practically work for her. And I work full-time. So it hadn't even occurred to me that those who were part-time were going to find that difficult to implement. And that actually, if we were to be so specific with our percentage split in the policy could actually indirectly discriminate against the people on our staff team who work part-time. So as a result of that feedback, I then changed the policy so that it stated that our staff have to work the majority of their hours in the office, but that it would be between them and their line manager to agree how that was actually practically going to work out for each individual. So I wrote that policy from my own experience, from my own point of view, and that's a natural thing to do. But by proactively seeking feedback from asking people around me, I was actually able to hear, able to understand a different lived experience to my own. It didn't occur to me that actually what I was writing was potentially discriminatory against people who work part-time. And actually that helped me to improve our policy. It helped me to make it more equitable for everybody across the organisation. And it helped me to become a wise builder, to bring out the values of equity in God's kingdom in my workplace. So when we actually think about practically putting this into our everyday lives, what does this look like? What kind of habits can we be adopting that's going to help us reduce our bias? Or to say it another way, how can we get into the habit, into the practice of seeking out and listening to other people around us? Well, we've suggested a few habits, things like taking time to have unhurried conversations with the people that we work with. So perhaps inviting someone out for a coffee, inviting someone to have a conversation, making time to offer people a cup of tea, going out of our way to strike up a conversation with someone. And it's not only in terms of the people that we speak to or the people that we spend time with, but actually thinking about reading widely, going to sources that would be outside of our echo chamber. Okay, how can we be expanding our horizons to help us be more informed when it comes to what we read and to what we watch? And then thinking about the habit of prayer. So praying specifically for God to give you opportunities to have a conversation, to listen, to be attentive to someone who you maybe normally wouldn't talk to, who might be different to who you are. And be aware of where God might be leading you in your workplace. Be intentional about asking and praying for the people around you in your team, in other teams across the organization. Is there somebody that you're struggling with at the moment? Pray for them, get that perspective, widen our perspective, and continue to do these things until we've listened long enough to understand another point of view. So when we come to think about what it is to be a wise builder, to be a type of person who is becoming more and more like Jesus in our workplace, who's building that foundation. Reducing our bias is a really important start to that. The second part that we're going to talk through is about weighing our options. So I think it's really important to acknowledge here, and I know that Tim already has, and maybe you did when you went into your breakout rooms, but actually the vast majority of decisions that we're going to make aren't going to have a clear-cut answer, okay? And you might be making the best decision that you can out of a range of bad options. And I think many people think about making a decision in quite a binary way, so almost like a GPS, right? You plug the decision into one end, you put the coordinates of where you want to get to, and then basically you follow the directions or the signposts that are going to get you there. And I think while that's part of the picture, it's not the whole picture. And I think what I've learned about my decision making, particularly in today's kind of volatile and quite complex world, I think it's more like flying a plane. So in the sky, a pilot has obviously not got any signs to follow, right? There aren't any road markings showing which way to go. There aren't direct paths laid out in front of them. Instead, they're following what's called waypoints on their radar. So these are small plotted out with small points that are plotted out across the trajectory of a flight path. And basically the plane flies from waypoints to waypoint, and the pilot's role is to make adjustments, to check the trajectory, to constantly make small adjustments to ensure that they're staying on course. And for me, I think that is a far better analogy of what decision making can be like for us, right? We have an endpoint in mind. We have a place that we want to get to, which is actually making a decision. But how we get to that place relies on ongoing adjustments, right? It relies on constant decision making. It relies on us keeping our trajectory on course. And it can rely on us building those foundations on the rock, right? Keeping our minds on what God's word has to say and who we are when we're living that out in our workplace. So again, just come back to kind of having some real life examples of this. During the deepest part of lockdown, my organization was one across many. Yours might have had to also go through this. So basically had to make widespread redundancies across our staff team. Now, due to the significant reduction that we got in our income, overnight we lost 15% of our income. We had to make about a quarter of all of our staff team redundant. And it was my job to lead that redundancy process and have the responsibility for ensuring that we were compliant with employment law. And I knew going into that, no decision that I made was going to be the right one, right? I knew that whatever decision I made, even if it was legal, would still have a significant impact on our staff team. And the hardest decision when we went through the actual process that I had to make was what method we would use to calculate who was going to be made redundant. So we basically had two choices. Either we used the matrix method and basically applied a weighting scoring to each person and making those on the wrong end of the scale redundant, or we could use interviews and everybody would have to interview in order to keep a job. Now, for me, that was a massively lose-lose decision to make, right? On one hand, I had to create a scoring system which scores people against a certain set of criteria around their performance and basically tells them that because of how they've acted in the past, they haven't got what it takes to keep their job. Or I create an interview process where people have to compete against each other to secure a future income. And to make the final decision, I basically went back to the building of my house. What values was I going to use to inform my decision here? And in the end, I drew on the value, one of the values that we hold as an organization. And that chimes quite nicely with my faith, which is that each person has dignity and value. And I decided to use the interview process. So we rolled out interview training for everybody across the organization. We trained our recruitment panels in fair and unbiased recruitment. We brought in an employee assistance program, which basically offers counselling to everybody going through the process. We reached out to the National Careers Service and they offered some bespoke training to support our staff who were going through redundancy. And I knew that that was an endpoint that I had to get to, right? We had to have a new staff structure. We had to get enough cost savings from our staff budget that we would have the safety to continue to operate as an organization. But I had to find my way through that situation. And I had to keep my inner life connected to that story that I'm a part of, God's story. and actually making the best decisions that I could at the time with the information that I had available to me, and applying my values as a lens to weigh my options really helped me in terms of choosing that way forward. It helped me to become a wiser builder. And actually, throughout the whole of the redundancy process, which lasted for about 4 months in terms of our consultation, I used LICC's Wisdom Prayer Journey on the YouVersion Bible app to help keep me grounded in God's word and wisdom. And that's just one of the kind of little habits that we're going to talk about this. So I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's just going to talk a little bit through the rest of the habits that you could use to actually become the type of person who weighs their options as a better builder.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And you've already alluded to a few of them, so let me just draw out what you've already said a bit more explicitly. This is where grounding ourselves in the story that we believe we're in, i.e. the story of the Bible, the story of what God is doing in the world, really matters. And on page 1 of that story, we see that God invests people with his image, and that gives dignity and value to every single person. And that's the story you've shared is a really good example of how that is a value that is anchored in the Bible, in your story that you believe you're living in, but how it actually plays out in your workplace. The Bible doesn't say choose the interview process over the score process, but it does give you that value, that waypoint to keep you moving in the right direction. So here I've put Bible at the desk, and I put it in brackets, but it is actually quite important, because what we found talking to Christians in the workplace at LICC is that actually those who are able to bring the practice of reading their Bible into their workspace, which might mean just turning up 10, 15 minutes early to get to their desk, does seem to do something psychologically that helps people connect the biblical story to that physical time and place that they are working in on that day. A little example of this would be my friend James. He's a medic. He was telling me he used to read his Bible in his car before he went into the hospital for that shift. And he'd read his Bible in his car before he went in, and he'd sit there and he'd pray a bit, until one day when a consultant came and knocked on his window because they thought he'd passed out in his car. He was actually praying, but they thought he'd passed out. So he thought, actually, maybe this isn't the kind of vibe that I want to be giving before I start my shift. So he decided to start taking his Bible into work. And actually now people ask him if they come into his office. He now works in GP surgery. If they come in and need to speak to him, sometimes they'll see his Bible is open, and when he does get interrupted, although that's not what he's hoping will happen in that time, but if he does get interrupted, it's a chance to open up a conversation about the kind of values that he wants to live by. So Bible at the desk, I wonder if that's a habit that you might be able to experiment with. A few more just to rattle through. Beth's already mentioned devotional and prayer journeys are really helpful here. Every day you just get one pinging into your inbox. LICC have got a few. YouVersion is good for this. I put a link in the chat. Do take a look at those. There's one around wisdom. There's one around working from rest, and a few others that you might find particularly helpful. We're just about to launch a new one on Mark's Gospel as well, which I'm quite excited about. As you do that, you might find yourself particularly resonating with some values, and it can be helpful. Some people find it useful to actually physically write out their values. What are the waypoints on my trajectory as I make decisions on any given workday that I want to guide me? And actually writing those out and putting them somewhere physically can be a very helpful reminder to keep you on track. And of course, it doesn't only have to be your written values. I have a friend of a colleague at LICC who says she experimented with tying bits of gold tape around different objects in her workspace. And every time she saw that gold tape, it was a mental note to think, oh, actually, yeah, I'm here for a reason, and I have some values and a purpose that I want to live out while I'm here. It just broke that kind of, the whirlwind of the day that you get into by seeing that bit of gold tape. And here's another one that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount as well, fasting. I think this is a great practice, in that if you are fasting from something, often it's something that you're used to having, and not having it is like a constant reminder with you. It could be a hunger pang, or it could be just a desire to check this that's in your pocket, but maybe you've left it on airplane mode or something. Every time you feel that desire, it's a reminder to you of why you decided to fast in the first place, which isn't just to be better at fasting, it's to anchor yourself more fully in the story that you're living in, so that you might be able to live out those values where you are. So there you go. There's just a few examples of the kinds of habits that might help you wayfare to make better decisions by weighing the options. So Beth, back to you, I think, for the next one.
Great, thanks. Okay, so the third part is about adapting. And for this part of the framework, we wanted to emphasize the point that no decision is perfect, right? And that no decision needs to be final, in as much as it can be. And I think we need to be constantly adapting our approach. So as we're weighing our options, we're making decisions, we're also adapting. And a huge part of this approach can actually be to get out of our own way in our decision making. So let me talk you through what I mean about this. So 10 years ago, when I was 23, I became chair of the Women's Staff Network at the University of Nottingham. So the Women's Staff Network basically exists to support, to champion, to advocate for the thousands of women and those who identify as women who work at the University of Nottingham. And the network has a committee of 10 people, all of whom were older than I was. And they were 10 people that I was leading. And one of the biggest events in our calendar was International Women's Day, which happens in March each year. So when it came to planning what we were going to do to celebrate International Women's Day, we had a range of different activities that we were going to put on, including a salsa dancing night. And we decided that we would invite stalls for independent businesses to come and sell and promote their work. So the committee signed off on the event. I went to the university's marketing team to basically ask them for a poster to promote the event, and they came back to me with this as the poster. So I sent it round to the committee to ask what they thought. The committee were all really positive, saying how striking it was, how it would stand out to people as we were walking down the corridor. And basically, I was really bolstered by that. I hit the go button, and this poster basically made it onto every wall, onto every digital screen, onto the university website. It went everywhere. And I went home that night actually really pleased with what we had accomplished. The next morning, I came into 250 emails, 250 complaints, 250 angry, disappointed, and actually some quite personal attacks aimed at me due to the sexist nature of the poster. So I had one quite memorable email from a member of academic staff, which still scars me, from the engineering department, basically congratulating me for destroying everything that they had built up with regards to gender equality in their 20-year career at the university with a single poster. And someone then put the poster on Twitter and had the description, the University of Nottingham Women's Staff Network stuck in their sexist portrayal of women. And as you can imagine, that went completely viral across the internet. We had the BBC, we had other national press wanting to get in touch to basically discuss and talk to the person who had actually put this poster out. And I had absolutely no idea what to do. No one had prepared me for this. Like, I hadn't had any training in what to do with crisis press, how to deal with hate mail, like how to deal with personal crushing disappointment. Like, I cried for most of the rest of that day. I cried on my way home, and then I cried at home some more. Like, there were a lot of tears. And the next day I came into the office, and basically I knew that I had to do something. I knew that I had to act. So I got in contact with the marketing team. I asked them for a new poster. I then sent an email out to all of the women in the Women's Staff Network across the university, apologising for our mistake. But I also thanked them for holding us to a higher accountability to better represent women at the university. I took responsibility for my mistake. I publicly apologised. I thanked the women who had been brave enough to stand up for what they believed in, brave enough to speak out when they saw something wrong, and stated our beliefs that it was only because of women like them that we would learn from our mistakes, that we would take responsibility for our actions, that we would believe in and do better for the women at the university in the future. And I sent out our new poster with the email that actually looked like this. And the flood of support that we got from the rest of the women at the university because of that email was absolutely overwhelming. I even had the Vice Chancellor at the university contact me personally to congratulate me on how I handled the situation and to offer their personal support to the work of the network moving forward. And actually, in the end, we had more people come along to that event than any other event that we ran as part of the Women's Staff Network that year. Women turned up in droves to celebrate with us. Now, I actually really hate telling that story because it makes me cringe in terms of even just remembering what it felt like to go through that. But this is one of the most important lessons that I've ever learned about adapting, right? Because I had to realize that I needed to let go of my pride, of my entitlement, of wanting to justify myself for the decision that I made, or wanting to blame the committee, saying, well, I sent it round to them and they all said it was fine. Like, I had to adapt the situation to the best outcome for everyone. And actually, I needed to get out of the way and do what was right for those that I was representing. And actually, this is such an important part of what it is to become the kind of person who is a wise builder, to adapt, to let go, to get out of your own way. And Tim's going to talk a little bit about the habits that can help you do that.
Yeah, I've been taking some classes in improv over the past 9 months, and one of the key principles in improv is learning to let go. And in particular, they talk about not letting go of control, but letting go of the illusion of control, because even though we don't have control really, we like to convince ourselves that we do. But what happens when we cling on to that illusion of control is that we just stir up our own anxiety and stress by getting preoccupied with things that are outside our sphere of influence. And I think Jesus is getting at this when he talks about not worrying about tomorrow, because tomorrow has its own problems. So letting go is about letting go of that need to grip onto everything and make sure it happens the way that I've decided it needs to happen. The Jesuits have a nice phrase that I often come back to. The good news is that there is a Messiah. The better news is it's not you. And when I think about that, I think, yeah, that's actually quite liberating, and it allows me to let go and trust that the things that are beyond my control are not for me to deal with. So it helps me loosen my grip on the things that I have to make decisions about. It helps me free myself from that sense of accountability anxiety. Actually, my responsibility, and I like that word that Beth dropped in there, my responsibility is to make the best decision that I can with the information that I have at the time. And when new information becomes available, as it did in Beth's story, then I'm totally free to change direction and adapt my decision accordingly. So here are some habits, that can help you in letting go. Firstly, you can surrender your calendar daily. I have a little pop-up reminder on my phone, comes in 9:15 every morning, and it just says, surrender your calendar. And it's just a little reminder for me to pray. And if I have a few minutes, I'll actually load up the calendar for that day and I'll pray over the meetings and the people that I might be seeing. Or if I don't have time, I'll just quickly pray, Lord, please help me steward this day well, but it's surrendered to you, whatever you want. So that when new information becomes available in the form of people interrupting me, I can actually welcome those interruptions as invitations into what God is doing, rather than irritations that they've derailed my plans and the things that I wanted doing that day. So surrendering my calendar daily is a practice that I'm now living with, and I found it to be quite helpful. Keeping a gratitude log is also very helpful. Practicing gratitude, I think, is a really good way to disarm the mentality that I'm entitled to things going my way, and instead training myself to notice the good things that are around me. So maybe that's my job, the work that I have to do, the people that I work with, the place I'm in, the taste of the coffee this morning, the technology working when it works. That kind of mentality, I think, helps me step into the day slightly differently. I love that verse in Ecclesiastes where the teacher says there's nothing better than for people to be happy and to do good while they live. And that sense of gratitude for what I have helps me be happy and do good while I'm living each day. And there's also apps for gratitude, so you can keep a little gratitude log. I think some people on this call even might be using them. So if that's you, do feel free to put a link in the chat to a gratitude log app. Here's a good one I got from Dallas Willard: silence and not having the last word. So the idea with silence is to learn to not have to be always on, always responding to things, always in control. So turning off notifications for a while can help with that. In my calendar each week, I try and build in a few hours of analog work time, and it's in my calendar so that people know I'm not going to be contactable digitally during that time. That's helpful for me. And as I train myself to sit in silence, I'm also learning that I don't need to have the last word in every conversation. Not every conversation needs to end the way that I want it to, especially if that person has irritated me and I want to make sure that I've ended things on my terms. Actually, that's not probably what Jesus is asking me to do in that situation. And I think about the life of Jesus, and I think about how happy he was to let people go away angry or sad, or maybe he wasn't happy, but he was at least content to let people go away angry or sad. He didn't always have the last word. He just left people where it needed to be left. And then lastly, I think giving is another good practice in this. It's a deeper work, learning to be a cheerful giver, and giving can be planned or spontaneous. And it's not only about money, it's also about my time. So again, how do I deal with interruptions? Am I willing to give up some of my time that day to be someone who lives generously That seems to be the way of the kingdom that Jesus advocates. And in doing that, I let go of my grip on my time, my possessions, and I can adapt to whatever comes my way. So there you go. There are some habits for letting go that helps adapt. And I'll take us into the last part of the model, which is about evaluating. Now, evaluating is slightly different to the other 3 quarters of this model in that often it requires stepping back from the situation that we're in to change our perspective on it. Essentially, it's a chance to review the impact of our decisions and to use that to make future decisions, or to use that to inform our decision-making process so that we might be better decision makers. So an example on this, the last few years of being involved in the student ministry here in Nottingham, I was also running the National Student Conference for the organisation I was with, and we wanted this conference to be positioned somewhere between the Christian world and the non-Christian world, so that it would be biblically grounded, but also kind of culturally relevant to students, so that Christian students would be able to come and engage, but also their curious friends who wouldn't call themselves Christians would be able to come to this conference. And that meant we had to think quite carefully about the kind of event that we wanted to run, and in particular, whether or not we would have sung worship as part of the conference. So in previous years, before I was leading the event, this was a regular feature, but I was really thinking about removing sung worship from the conference so that it would maintain a kind of accessible feel for people who weren't used to singing together when they went to a conference. So one meeting, this was an agenda item, do we have sung worship? And I kind of put forward what I just told you about, thinking we should maybe take this out. And we looked at some evaluation forms from previous years, and predictably enough, some participants said they absolutely loved sung worship, some really didn't get on with it at all, some wanted the worship to be more contemporary, some wanted it to be more traditional, some wanted more of it, some wanted a lot less of it. It's kind of a bit of a Marmite factor, sung worship at conferences. So we discussed it as a team, we evaluated what's the information that we've got here, why did we make the decision that we made before, and what decision do we want to make now? And we went through a lot of this cycle. We wouldn't have labeled it in this way, but we were trying to reduce our bias, weigh the options in front of us as objectively as possible, and adapt our decision. And we discussed that having sung worship actually made certain things possible that taking it out meant we would lose. So we actually wanted to be a conference that invited more people to participate up front. And we wanted to offer a conference experience that wasn't just intellectual. We wanted to hold space for different traditions to be represented. And all of this led us to the conclusion that actually we did want to be a conference that had sung worship in it, albeit led by a hip, trendy worship leader from a conservative background. So thereby satisfying both parties on the feedback forms. So anyway, I went in with one decision and then we evaluated it, we looked at the data and we came out with a different one. And I think really the value there was the process of throwing it round and giving ourselves time to reflect on what we'd learned and what we wanted to do going forwards. So reflecting, I would say then, is the habit that helps us better evaluate. And here are a few practical examples of how to reflect. And I'm sure you are probably already doing many of these. Firstly, debriefs and reviews in a team setting. So you don't have to just do this on your own. If there's a chance after an event or a decision, it doesn't have to be an event, I guess, to get with a team, to throw it around with some people who are coming from different perspectives than you are, that's only going to help you reflect and evaluate better. There's a practice that some of you might be familiar with called the examine. This is a little prayer routine that you can do at the end of each day, and it's just walking back through your day and looking at it from God's perspective, evaluating and reflecting, God, where were the things here that honored you, that I'm glad about, and where were the things here that were less honoring to you, and where I need your grace to help me do better with tomorrow. In a moment, I'll put a link to the examine in the chat, or maybe Beth, you could just look it up. There's some there's an examine app that you can get, and there's various podcasts and stuff that you can download, and they'll talk you through a guided exam. It only takes 15 minutes at the end of each day. I don't manage to do it every day, but I'm always glad that I did when I do manage to make time for the examine. And what happens is, as you do the examine as a daily practice, is that it feeds its way into your being during the day. So it doesn't only happen at the end of the day. You notice yourself starting to do it during the day as well. Going back to this idea of reflecting and evaluating being a bit outside the decision-making process, retreats are often really helpful just to reorient ourselves, get a different perspective. And we've got an event coming up on this, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then also the habit of Sabbath. This is very much in vogue at the moment. The central idea of Sabbath is rest, basically. Resting from the noise and the pace of working life. Reattuning ourselves to God's perspective on what really matters. So productivity and my desire to get things done might not always be the best operating principle. Actually, God seems to view the world a bit differently than that. And Sabbath reconnects me with his way of viewing my to-do list and my workload. It's been said that Sabbath is the hardest commandment to keep. So if that's true for you, maybe you could just start small. If you can't go 24 hours without your phone, for example, why not just try turning it off after 6 p.m. or not checking it before 9 a.m. That was a habit I had through Lent, a kind of micro Sabbath from my phone before 9 a.m. each day. And it was brilliant. I have to say, I did a lot more reading. I did a lot more kind of useful stuff with that time at the start of each day than I was when I was just checking my phone. So there you go. There's some examples. And that wraps up the model. So there's lots in there. We've shared some examples that are hopefully helpful.
I think I want to say a big wow. I don't know about the rest of you, but I was left slightly breathless, slightly speechless, but not entirely. We had a really good breakout group. I hope everybody else did as well. So welcome back. Now, I know there are already a number of questions on Mentimeter. Do please keep the questions coming in. That would be absolutely brilliant. And we're going to switch to Mentimeter in just a second. I think I need to do that. So just bear with me a moment. Or Tim, are you going to do that for me? Not quite too sure.
We don't need to screen share, Steve. I think it's all right as long as you can see.
No, cool, fine. I will just make sure I can see the questions, and I'm going to just ask you and Beth. So yeah, that's fine. Just bear with me one quick second. Right, okay. There's one question that came in that is not on Mentimeter, and Beth, I'm just going to ask this to you, just given all that you said about and your openness to share from that situation. Just intrigued if you could unpack a little bit more for us. What happened? You know, visions of the pink shoes, the posters, all the stuff that came back at you. What made the difference when you, either before you went into work that second day or as you went into work, what made you think, stop, pause, to choose a different way? What was it that happened there?
I think it was probably multiple things, to be honest. I distinctly remember walking home, crying my eyes out and calling Tim on my way home, basically to be like, I have no idea what to do, yeah. And I think I went for a run that evening, which always helps. That's the way that, in fact, someone said something to me the other day that I found so helpful, that was that if you're having any sort of intense feelings like anxiety or bitter disappointment, as I was at the time, that's actually a physical thing, and we need to do something physical to get rid of it. So whether that be crying or like a physical release, or actually going out to do exercise, like we can so often think that feelings are just kind of stay in there and just kind of dissipate in their own way, but actually what we really need to do is do something physical to get rid of them. So that's just a little thing. I would love to say, I mean, this was 10 years ago now, so I'd love to say that I was really godly and had this whole like evening of prayer and fasting, and it was really like whatever. And I hope that I did, because I hope I am the type of person that when I have really difficult times like that I would turn to God and I would pray about it. But I think, to be honest, it was the culmination of a lot of very small decisions that I've made throughout my life about willing to put myself out and step into the limelight and step into that leadership position, that when it all hit the fan and went horribly wrong, that I went, now is the time that I basically get to decide, with God's help, how I am going to react in this moment, in this situation. And I remember thinking, okay, in a week's time, in a month's time, in a year's time, in 3 years' time, when I look back on this situation, in 10 years' time, when I'm telling this story to other people and I look back on this situation, what do I want to remember about how I acted in this moment? And that was a really guiding, helpful perspective for me to think through, who do I want to be, and what are the characteristics and the character traits that are going to help me demonstrate and model who it is that I want to be. So I think probably when I sat down to write that email, those were the questions that were going around my head. You know, my whole world is taken up by this at the moment, but it's not always going to be like this. And when I look back, what's going to help who is the type of person that I want to have been. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And thanks for that, Beth. I think particularly somebody's already commented on the chat, being able to do something physically to get into a different zone. But thanks for what you've drawn out there in terms of just the opportunity to pause, almost pause out of the current situation and think, actually, yes, what might be. No, really appreciate that. Tim, perhaps one for you. Somebody's asked, often in my work, I don't have final responsibility for making decisions, but I still want to honor the process. So how do I stay engaged and Christ focus when I might not agree with the final outcome of a decision?
Yeah, that's a great question, a very real question. I think often lots of us, if we're in any organisation bigger than just being self-employed, are probably at some point or another going to have to deal with decisions that we might not agree with. So yeah, I think probably what I would say, sorry, I'm just checking that we're all spotlighted and everyone can see everyone. Can people see me on screen? Beth, can you see me all right? Good? Okay, cool, sorry. Yeah, is that, firstly, as you've already said in the question, the desire to stay engaged is really important. The more you opt out, the more you're going to be seen to be opting out, and the less opportunities there will be in future to be involved in the decision making. So I think even when you can't influence the decision directly, staying involved and, if at all appropriate, making your feelings known to your manager or to the person who's making the decision is really important. And if they are a good manager, they will at least acknowledge that they have heard you. And I think that's what really matters. And often if we feel like we've been heard, we can move forward with less cognitive dissonance. Just a real life example of this, a very tricky issue. A friend that I have, he is on a doctor, is on a ward at the moment, and he's weighing up whether or not he feels like he can administer abortion medication on the wards. And his Christian convictions would lead him to think that actually that's not something I want to do. But on the other hand, I'm here to do a job, and this is the decision that's been made, it's been approved, and I'm here to carry it out. So then he was weighing out, oh, do I want to be the awkward person who gets in the way and causes a lot of controversy? So that all I encouraged him to do was basically what I've just said here, which was stay engaged, keep the conversation alive, and there will be people that you can talk to so that you know that your voice has been heard along the way.
I think the only thing I'd add to that, if I may, is pray about it. That seems like a really obvious thing, right? But I'm just going to put that out there anyway, because I've had some experiences, particularly towards the beginning of my career, where I was working in a workplace that just really had values that I didn't agree with, especially in their performance management process. It was just really shocking in the way that they treated people. And my line manager had no power to change anything. So a lot of the time I spent praying over whoever it was that was making decisions about things. And, it took 5 years in the end for them to change, but it did actually change in the end. And praise be to God for that. So yeah, praying over stuff as well.
I think taking that long view, the long game is really, really helpful. Sorry, yeah, go on, Steve.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Beth. Beth, this is perhaps one for you. Somebody's asked helpfully, what role can mentors or coaches play in our decision making?
Do you know what? This is such a good question. And I would highly recommend, if you have the option to have a good mentor or a good coach available to you, they can really just add rocket fuel to your own reflection. And that last area within the framework that we've just gone through. In fact, I was hanging out with one of my own mentees, and she wouldn't call herself a Christian just on Monday, actually. And she'd come out of a really, really difficult meeting, and she was in floods of tears, and she's really struggling in her role. And all I did was ask good questions and listened well. And she did all of the work in terms of reflecting and thinking about her situation and answering her own thoughts, and actually just being able to pull out what she was actually really thinking in it. And I think it comes into almost a bit of reducing bias and reflecting, of having someone else speak into your life and help you reflect well and learn from them, and have a consistent relationship where somebody is checking in on you and asking you lots of good questions, just giving you a space to unpack yourself. it has been, I think, one of the most, for me, important parts of what it is now that I'm in senior leadership and stepping up even more so. I wouldn't be where I am today without the amazing mentors and coaches that I've had. So yeah, please, if you have the opportunity, or if you would even be interested, I hear that Tim Yearsley has something called Mentor Link Up that LICC does that might interest you as well.
Yeah, well, Mentor Link Up, something we're trialing for people who are just transitioning out of university, but we do think mentoring can really make such a difference. We've built it into the Emerging Leaders program. So if you're interested in being connected with a mentor, then Emerging Leaders could be the course for you.
That's great. No, thanks, Beth, and thanks, Tim, for that. Just to echo, Beth, what you've said, as a mentor myself, I think the question that you probably want to ask if you're a mentee and you want to remember to be the one you're answering as a mentor is kind of listen and learn, exactly as you said, Beth. You're looking for people who can help you listen and learn, so that in a sense you're helped through the current situation, but you also learn, what do I do in the future? I guess the distinction from my perspective between a coach, which I've done some of before, is equally having somebody who's perhaps an expert in an area who can show you how you can do something. So it's not necessarily, again, providing the solution, but how do I work this thing through? So I think that's really, really helpful. Tim, can I come to you just for another question that's been asked? Let me just quickly get it in front of me here. Yeah, how do you navigate a workplace where your values don't align with your manager's or company's values or decision making?
Yeah, another great question, one that's very real. I mean, every workplace is a challenge in that regard. My first answer, and it might sound flippant, but it's not meant to be, is go and read Daniel chapters 1 to 5. Here is a young guy, an emerging leader in a foreign context. Well, not only a foreign context, the context of his oppressors, his kidnappers, who's put to work in an organization to be part of this organizational machine that has oppressed his own people. So how does Daniel navigate that? And I think there's lots to draw out. Very briefly, I'd say keep an eye out for the way he speaks and who he speaks to. Keep an eye out for the habits that he grounds himself in. We've talked a lot about habits this evening. I think that's there. Keep an eye out for the quality of the work that he does there, which is quite subversive, but very powerful, I think. And then lastly, yeah, just pay attention to his relationship with God in that. How does he navigate that? So that's not a necessarily practical answer. For the practical stuff, I'd refer back to that first question about stay engaged, stay part of the process. But for a bit of perspective, you can't do much better than those chapters in Daniel. So
I think also, sorry if I can jump in on that, is that it's quite easy to say, oh, my own values don't resonate with the values of this organization or this line manager or this particular thing. And my question would be, okay, well, which values? So it's quite easy to kind of generalize in terms of like who I am and the way that this organization is working, but actually, can you spend time, and this is actually something Daniel does really well in the story that Tim has just been talking about. What are the key values that you hold, and what are the values that you are not willing to compromise on, and what are the values? And actually, I think in a lot of workplaces that we work in, it is the behaviors that demonstrate what actually the values really are. So is it that there is a value that you don't like, or is it actually that there's an organizational or an individual behavior that you disagree with? Because if that's the case, then actually working and how you go about talking to that or dealing with that is quite different to, you know, fundamentally disagreeing with the value of the organization. So I'd actually spend some time reflecting and just really work out, is it behaviors that you disagree with? Is it values that you disagree with? What are your key values and what are ones that you're not willing to compromise on? And then weighing your options in terms of, once you've got that information and you can inform yourself in your decision making, weigh your options, adapt, you know, reflect and evaluate.
No, thank you very much indeed, Tim and Beth. And again, thanks for both of you diving in on that one. Really helpful to have that very practical wisdom, Beth. And again, I think it's going back to your model, part of that, I guess, listening element in terms of we can react very quickly to something without, as you said, just calmly analysing, hang on, whose values, what's at stake here.
We're just going to end with a bit of liturgy, actually. So it will come up on the screen, and If you feel comfortable joining in where you are, then please do so. Beth will play the role of the leader and I'll be the voice of the people. So we'll pray through this and also a big amen to end, and then we'll be out of here.
Okay, so I will be leader, and if you want to join in the bit for the people, that is also in bold. That would be brilliant. If you could just keep yourselves on mute so that there isn't lots of echoes that's carrying along, but please do speak them out with Tim as well. Our lives are so small, O Lord.
Our vision so limited.
Our courage so frail.
Our hours so fleeting.
Therefore, give us grace and guidance for the journey ahead. We are gathered here because we believe that we are called together into a work we cannot yet know the fullness of.
Still, we trust the voice of the one who has called us.
And so we offer to you, O God, these things.
Our dreams, our plans, our vision.
Shape them as you will.
Our moments and our gifts.
May they be invested towards bright, eternal ends.
Richly bless the work before us, Father.
Shepherd us well, lest we grow enamoured of our own accomplishments or entrenched in old habits. Instead, let us listen for your voice, our hearts ever open to quiet beckonings of your spirit in this endeavour.
Let us, in true humility and poverty of spirit, remain ever ready to move at the impulse of your love in paths of your design.
Let all that we do here, in these our brief lives, in this our brief moment to love, in this the work you have ordained for this community, flower in winsome and beautiful foretaste of greater glories yet to come.
O Spirit of God, now shape our hearts. O Spirit of God, now guide our hands. O Spirit of God, now build your kingdom among us. Amen.